From humanitarian aid to weapon of vengeance. How Soviet pilots turned the American Boston into the main naval killer of the Third Reich. Hello, friends. Before we dive into this incredible story, do me a favor? If you get hooked on what I'm writing about, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments. Did you even know about this story? Your opinion and your reaction are incredibly important to me, because the story I want to tell you today is not just dry facts. It's a story of desperation, brilliant improvisation, and ruthless efficiency. A story of how, in the hands of seemingly doomed men, an ordinary aircraft became a legend. I promise you won't be able to tear yourself away. Let's go. Imagine June 1941. You are a Soviet pilot. You spent years learning to fly specific machines, knowing their weak and strong points. And one morning, everything collapses. German Messerschmitts and Junkers have swarmed the sky like locusts. Thousands of Soviet aircraft are destroyed right on the airfields, without even having time to take off. Catastrophe. Collapse. It seems there is no chance. The Luftwaffe reigns supreme, and the Red Army is retreating, losing men and equipment at an alarming rate. The country desperately needs any help. And help came, but not the kind that was perhaps expected. Under the Lend-Lease program, that grand lifebuoy thrown by the West, the first convoys began arriving in the ice-choked ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. And among this equipment were not the formidable flying Fortress B-17s that newspapers wrote so much about. Instead, dozens of light, almost elegant twin-engine Douglas A-20 bombers arrived. The Allies called it the Havoc, a twist of fate, perhaps, because initially, this aircraft did not evoke much enthusiasm among Soviet specialists. Light bomber, they shrugged, looking at its modest, by their standards, characteristics. They expected strategic giants but got a tactical machine. What could be done with this American against the most powerful military machine of the Wehrmacht? Turned out, everything. This is a story not just about an airplane. It's a story about how Soviet military thought, pushed to the brink of survival, performed a small miracle. How, from a tool created for one set of tasks, the perfect killer was forged for a war no one had planned. The Boston, as Soviet pilots affectionately and respectfully called it, became a shadow over the Baltic and Black Seas, a nightmare for every German and Romanian captain. It transformed from humanitarian aid into a symbol of retribution. And here's how it happened. The wrong gift, anatomy of an unexpected genius. Let's travel back to the late 1930s in the USA. The Douglas Company, under the leadership of the brilliant but then still young designer Ed Heinemann, is designing a new aircraft. Heinemann would later create the legendary A-4 Skyhawk attack aircraft, but for now his task is a modern light bomber. And he creates not just a machine but a benchmark of aerodynamic thought. The A-20 is an all-metal, cantilever monoplane. It sounds complicated, but the meaning is simple. It's a very clean, streamlined aircraft without unnecessary struts and braces. A high-wing configuration, tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel, which was still a novelty in the late 30s. All of this made it unlike the angular Soviet SB or British Blenheims. It looked fast, and it was. Two powerful radial Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines propelled it to a cruising speed of 540 kilometers per hour. Get this, that's the speed of some fighters at the start of the war. It was fast as lightning and maneuverable for its weight class. But there was a downside. To achieve such flight qualities, sacrifices had to be made. Armor was minimal, defensive armament was modest. The Americans and British saw it as a high-speed bomber that could evade interception, or a night fighter. The main modification that went to the USSR was the A-20G. It had a solid nose, bluntly packed with 6 heavy 12.7mm Browning machine guns. It was a veritable flying battery, created for strafing ground targets at treetop level. But here was the problem. For work over the sea, for finding a small, moving target on a vast expanse of water, the navigator needed a view. And in this solid nose, he sat as if in a barrel, observing the world through a tiny periscope. This was completely unacceptable. And here began what I call Soviet alchemy. Genius lies not in creating the perfect from scratch, but in making what is needed from what is available. Soviet engineers in workshops at frontline aviation repair bases, and later at factories, took and sawed off this formidable nose. In its place, they installed a glazed, transparent nose cone, like on earlier modifications of the Boston. But they didn't just revert to the old configuration. They retained 2 of the 6 machine guns in the lower section. The result was a hybrid. Excellent visibility for the navigator bombardier and preserved firepower for self-defense or, even more importantly, for strafing ship decks before a torpedo attack. This was the first but not the last step. The Boston was not originally adapted to carry torpedoes, the main caliber of naval aviation. Soviet engineers developed and implemented external racks for the powerful Soviet 4536AN torpedo and for naval mines AMG-1 and AMD weighing up to 1,000 kilograms. The machine could carry 1 torpedo or up to 2 tons of bombs on external racks. Its versatility became phenomenal. Reconnaissance, bomber, masthead bomber, torpedo bomber, mine layer. Let's look at the numbers, comparing it with its contemporaries. I will specifically go through the table from your query, but bring it to life. Crew, 3 people. Compact, without extra mouths. Pilot, navigator bombardier, also the nose gunner, and radio operator gunner defending the rear hemisphere. Engines, 2 Wright R2600 Cyclone engines of 1,600 horsepower each. More powerful than the German Ju-88's engines, 2,200 versus 1,200 horsepower per engine. Speed, 523 kilometers per hour, max. This is faster than the German Do-17Z, 410, and almost on par with the Ju-88, 470. Speed is life. Range, 1,520 kilometers. Enough to reach enemy shipping lanes and return. The Ju-88's range with a bomb load, by the way, was comparable. Bomb load, up to 1,800 kilograms. Impressive. The P-2, our main dive bomber, could carry a maximum of 1,000. But the key is not the weight but what and how could be attached. A torpedo is a weapon of a different order. Survivability. This was the main ace in the hole. The American design turned out to be incredibly forgiving. The plane could suffer terrible holes, lose part of its skin, but keep flying. Air-cooled radial engines were much less vulnerable than liquid-cooled ones. A hit in one cylinder wouldn't disable the entire engine. Pilots recounted that Boston's returned to base with 1 working engine, with shattered cockpit canopies, but they returned. So, before us are not just numbers. Before us is a portrait of the ideal platform. Fast, capable of carrying a heavy load, survivable, and, critically important, flexible. Like a canvas for an artist. And Soviet pilots became the artists of death who took up this brush. The dance of death over the waves. Tactics born of desperation. Have you ever thought about how ships were actually sunk in that war? This isn't a game where you press a button and a missile flies. This hellish work, mathematics, icy composure, and incredible risk. German convoys in the Baltic and Black Seas were not just transports. They were tough nuts to crack. Each ship was guarded by destroyers, patrol boats, minesweepers. On the decks, dozens of anti-aircraft autocannons, formidable 20mm and 37mm flak guns, spitting a steel downpour into the sky. Approaching such a convoy head-on at medium altitude is suicide. The aircraft would turn into a sieve in seconds. And Soviet naval aviation invented its own symphonic, deadly ballet. The directors were the commanders of the mine torpedo regiments. Act 1, Reconnaissance. A Boston with a glazed nose would take to the sky. Its task was to comb squares of the sea. This high speed allowed it to escape German patrols. The navigator, with excellent visibility, looked for smudges on the horizon, silhouettes. Finding a convoy was half the battle. Its course, speed, and escort composition needed to be determined. All of this was sent by radio signal to the command post. Act 2. Smashing the clock. The first to approach the target were IL-2 attack aircraft, the flying tanks. Their task was gruesome. At treetop level, under a leaden rain, with machine gun, cannon fire, and rockets, to suppress the anti-aircraft crews on the decks of the escort ships. They were gouging out the eyes of the anti-aircraft beast. This was work to the point of exhaustion with monstrous losses. Act 3. The strike from above. While the escort was distracted by the hunchbacks, the affectionate nickname for the IL-2, dive bombers PE-2 would dive from altitude. Their target was the transports. A whistle, bomb release, pull out from the dive. Chaos on the decks, fires, damage. The convoy loses formation, speed. Act 4, the finale, the decisive salvo. And then, when the convoy was already ragged, shrouded in smoke, the Bostons went into action. They had two main trump cards. Torpedo attack. They would approach the target from the side, at an altitude of literally 30 to 50 meters above the water. At such a height, they were invisible to radars, which were primitive then, and for anti-aircraft gunners to spot an aircraft flying at 500 kilometers per hour against the sea background was incredibly difficult. They would approach from the stern or bow of the transport, the deadest zones for anti-aircraft guns. At a distance of several hundred meters, they would release the torpedo. It would drop into the water, begin its run, and the Boston, at full throttle, would sharply veer away, evading fire. The torpedo, weighing almost a ton, would hit the side and blow the ship apart from the inside. It was a sure kill, masthead bombing. If there were no torpedoes or conditions didn't allow it, they used another, no less effective tactic. The Boston, also at treetop level, would rush directly at the ship's side. But it wouldn't drop a torpedo. Instead, a few hundred meters out, it would drop conventional high-explosive bombs, often large caliber, with such timing that they, hitting the water, would ricochet and crash directly into the ship's side, at or even below the waterline. Imagine. From behind the waves, a swift shadow suddenly leaps out, black dots separate from it, which, skipping across the water like flat stones, rush towards you. Evading such an attack was practically impossible, and the plane had already swept over the masts and disappeared. This was a perfectly tuned conveyor belt of death. And in it, the Bostons were given the key final role, the role of the executioner. They finished what was started, and they did it masterfully. The hunters, the combat path from the Black Sea to the Baltic. History is not abstract concepts. It is specific people, dates, and ships going to the bottom. Let's trace the map where the Bostons left their bloody trail. The Black Sea, 1943 to 1944. Here, among others, the 36th Mine Torpedo Aviation Regiment of the Black Sea Fleet Air Force operated. Their main target became the convoys trying to evacuate the defeated German-Romanian troops from the Crimea. The Germans called this evacuation operation 60,000 for the number of people they hoped to evacuate. Soviet pilots did everything to make that number many times smaller. April 18, 1944. A group of A-20GS locates the Romanian transport Alba Iulia, the former French Ocean. On board are not only troops but also, according to some reports, Soviet prisoners of war. The convoy is covered by destroyers and boats. Despite the barrage of fire, the Bostons break through. The bombs land accurately. A monstrous explosion is heard, ammunition on board detonates. The ship turns into a torch and is later written off. This was not an isolated incident. The Bostons worked like surgeons, cutting transport after transport out of convoys, dooming thousands of soldiers to death or capture. The Baltic, 1944 to 1945. The pinnacle of glory. If the work in the Black Sea was hard, then in the Baltic a real hunting season began for the Bostons, and their main prey became the grandiose German Operation Hannibal, the largest naval evacuation in history. From the Courland Pocket, from East Prussia, from Pomerania, the Germans tried to evacuate more than 2 million people. Elite troops, wounded, refugees. For the pilots of the 1st Guards Mine Torpedo Regiment and the 51st Mine Torpedo Regiment of the Baltic Fleet Air Force, this was paradise. The sea literally teemed with targets. Transports, overcrowded to the limit, often without proper escort, followed a single route. The Bostons attacked in any weather. In fog, snowstorms, at night. They laid mines on fairways, ambushing convoys, and sank ships with torpedoes and bombs. October 31st, 1944. A torpedo from a Boston finds its mark. The German transport Bremerhaven. The ship, carrying hundreds of people, goes to the bottom. 410 people perish. July 16, 1944. Operation Bagatelle. This story deserves its own telling. The Germans brought the floating anti-aircraft battery Niobe to the Finnish port of Kaka. It was the former Dutch cruiser Gelderland, turned into a stationary fortress. 8 105mm anti-aircraft guns, numerous 20mm and 40mm autocannons, covered an important port. Soviet intelligence tracked it. Destroying such a target was a task of the highest difficulty. And again, the balanced fist went into action. After attacks by IL-2s and P-2s, which distracted and suppressed fire, 4 A-20GS of the 51st Regiment went on the attack. They approached on their attack run at mast height, classic masthead bombing. 2 bombs of 1,000 kilograms each found their target. The Niobe broke in two and sank in a matter of minutes, taking most of its crew with it. This was the calling card of the Navy Air Force tactics. May 4, 1945. The war is practically over, but the hunters are still at their post. Bostons of the same 51st Regiment locate and attack the former German auxiliary cruiser Orion, which at the beginning of the war terrorized Allied shipping, sinking a dozen ships. Now it is a fugitive, and the Bostons put a final, definitive period in its biography. The price of victory and the genius of improvisation. Instead of an epilogue, let's summarize with numbers that speak more eloquently than any long speech. During the war years, Soviet pilots in A-20 Bostons conducted more than 200 successful torpedo bombing attacks. Confirmed sinkings number 40 enemy combat and transport vessels with a total tonnage of over 100,000 tons. How many more ships were sent to the bottom by the mines they laid is impossible to count exactly. For these feats, 6 naval aviation pilots who fought on Bostons became heroes of the Soviet Union. Mine torpedo regiments armed with these machines became Guards regiments, the elite of the fleet. But what does all this mean on a global scale? This is not a story about the superiority of American technology. It is a triumph of Soviet military thought and engineering ingenuity. The USSR received a good but ordinary tool, and, like a true master, instead of complaining that it didn't fit, it resharpened it, adapted it, honed it for its own specific needs. The A-20 was not the most armored IL-2, not a specialized dive bomber, P-2, not the longest ranged, but it became the most versatile and most effective in its niche, the war on sea communications. It became the perfect expression of the fast, cheap, effective principle. It was mass-produced, almost 3,000 machines were delivered to the USSR. Reliable and easy to maintain, it saved pilots' lives with its survivability. It allowed the execution of tasks that would have been impossible to solve by other means. This story also has a deep economic subtext. Lend-Lease is often assessed in numbers. So many tanks, so many planes, so much can stew. But its true value was in quality and filling gaps. The USSR could produce vast quantities of simple and effective equipment, T-34, IL-2. But there were problems with some complex, high-tech items. The A-20, with its superb aerodynamics and engines, was exactly such an item. It freed up Soviet factories to produce the equipment they made best, while itself covering narrow but critically important sectors of the front. The story of the Boston is a microcosm of the entire Great Patriotic War. It's a story of how, in a moment of deepest crisis, minds were found not to panic, but to analyze, adapt, and win. It's a monument not only to the pilots but also to those unknown engineers in greasy overalls who remodeled aircraft noses in cold workshops, and to the tacticians who devised this deadly dance over the waves. As long as the Bostons were in the sky, no captain of an Axis ship, from the Black Sea to the Baltic, could feel safe. Even off his native shore, even in the most heavily guarded convoy, he could be overtaken by a swift shadow, carrying with it either a snarling torpedo or bouncing bombs frogs on the water. It was a hunter, and it did its job flawlessly. That's all for now, friends. I hope I managed to convey to you the range of feelings I experience myself when I delve into such stories. This is not just iron and statistics. These are fates, genius, desperation, and triumph. If it was as interesting for you to read as it was for me to write, do the following. Write in the comments which episode amazed you the most, the one with the Niobe, with the Alba Lulia, or maybe the masthead bombing tactic itself. And, of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I have many more such stories, pulled from oblivion and smelling of gunpowder, metal, and sea salt. I promise it won't be boring. Bye.